The morning frost hadn't yet melted from the wooden fence posts when Jacob Mitchell heard the sound that would change everything. It wasn't the usual neighing of his horses or the gentle lowing of cattle that filled the dawn air of his ranch. In Cedar Falls, Montana, this was different, a soft whimpering, almost human, coming from the old stable he rarely used anymore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jacob paused, his weathered hands tightening around the feed. Bucket he carried. At 62, he'd heard every sound a ranch could make, but this was something else entirely. Something that made his heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with his morning coffee. What he discovered in that stable would shake the very foundations of Cedar Falls, a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where secrets were, as rare as summer snow. But some secrets, Jacob would soon learn, were worth keeping, and some discoveries were worth risking everything for. The sun was barely cresting the horizon when Jacob Mitchell stepped out of his farmhouse, the screen, doctor creaking on hinges that had weathered 40 Montana winters. His breath formed small clouds in the crisp October air as he surveyed his property, 300 acres of rolling pasture that had been in the Mitchell family for 4 generations. Cedar Falls stretched out below his ranch, a town of barely 800 souls nestled in a valley where the mountains met the plains. From his vantage point, Jacob could see the church steeple, the water tower with its faded paint, and the main street that consisted of Thompson's General Store, Molly's Diner, the post office, and not much else. It was the kind of place where a man could live his entire life and never want for anything more than honest work and decent neighbors. Jacob had done exactly that. Born in the upstairs bedroom of the very house he now called home, he'd left only once, for 2 tours in Vietnam that he rarely spoke about. When he returned in 1973, he'd married Sarah Whitmore, the prettiest girl in 3 counties, and settled into the rhythm of ranch life. They'd run cattle, raised quarter horses, and built a life that felt as solid as the mountains surrounding them. That was before the cancer took Sarah 5 years ago, before the loneliness crept in like winter fog, settling into every corner of the house and refusing to lift, before the ranch began to feel less like a home and more like a monument to everything he'd lost. These days, Jacob kept fewer cattle, just enough to maintain the grazing permits and keep the land from going to seed. The horse operation had dwindled to a handful of aging mares and one ornery gelding named Buck, who seemed to share Jacob's general disposition toward the world. Most of the outbuildings stood empty now, relics of busier times, when hired hands had bunked in the bunkhouse and the machine shed had hummed with activity during harvest season. The old stable where Jacob heard the whimpering hadn't housed horses in over a decade. Built by his grandfather in the 1920s, it was a testament to craftsmanship from an era when men built things to last. Hand-hewn beams supported a peaked roof that had weathered countless storms, and the wide doors still hung true on their original hardware. Jacob had been meaning to convert it into storage, but somehow never found the motivation. It stood empty, save for some old hay bales and forgotten farm equipment. As he approached the stable that morning, feed bucket in hand, the whimpering grew more distinct. It was definitely human, a sound of distress that made every paternal instinct Jacob possessed spring to life. He quickened his pace, boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. The stable doors were slightly ajar, which struck him as odd. He was meticulous about securing buildings, a habit ingrained by decades of dealing with Montana weather and the occasional curious bear. Jacob set down the feed bucket and carefully pulled one of the heavy doors wider, letting the early morning light spill into the dim interior. What he saw made him stop breathing. Huddled in the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of hay bales, was a child. A girl, he realized, maybe 10 or 11 years old, with tangled brown hair that hung like a curtain around her face. She wore a thin cotton dress that had once been yellow, but was now stained with dirt and something darker. Her bare feet were dirty and scratched, and her arms wrapped around her knees in a protective posture that spoke of practiced hiding. But it was her eyes that hit Jacob like a physical blow. They were too old for her face, filled with a wariness that belonged to someone who had seen far too much of the world's cruelty. When she looked up at him, those eyes held the same expression he'd seen in the faces of refugees during the war, the look of someone who had learned not to expect kindness from strangers. "Easy there, sweetheart," Jacob said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He crouched down, making himself less intimidating. The way he'd learned to approach spooked horses. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl didn't respond, but she didn't flee either. She watched him with the intensity of a wild animal, calculating whether this new threat required fight or flight. Jacob could see her trembling, whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. Probably both. "Are you hungry?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle and steady. "I was just about to make some breakfast. Pancakes, maybe, and hot chocolate. You looked like you could use some hot chocolate." At the mention of food, something flickered in the girl's expression. Her eyes darted toward the stable entrance, as if checking for escape routes, then back to Jacob. He could practically see the war being waged in her mind, the desperate need for food and warmth battling against whatever had taught her to fear adults. Jacob slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a granola bar, one of several he always carried for the long days working on the ranch. He placed it on the ground, halfway between them, and backed away a step. "That's for you," he said. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." The girl stared at the granola bar for a long moment before inching forward. Her movements were careful, deliberate, like someone who had learned that sudden gestures could bring unwanted attention. She snatched the bar and retreated to her corner, tearing it open with fingers that shook from more than just the cold. Jacob watched her eat with the desperate efficiency of someone who didn't know where their next meal was coming from. She consumed every crumb, licked the wrapper clean, and then looked at him with an expression that was part gratitude, part continued wariness. "What's your name, honey?" Jacob asked. The girl's lips moved, but no sound came out. She tried again, her voice barely a whisper when she finally managed to speak. "Emma, Emma," Jacob repeated as if testing the name. "That's a pretty name. I'm Jacob. This is my ranch. Have you been sleeping out here for a long?" Emma nodded, then seemed to think better of giving away too much information. Her gaze darted around the stable, taking inventory of potential threats and exits, with the paranoid efficiency of someone far too young to possess such skills. "Are you hurt anywhere, Emma? Do you need a doctor?" She shook her head quickly, too. Quickly. Jacob had seen enough injuries in his time to recognize someone who was hurting but afraid to admit it. The way she held her left arm suggested something was wrong there, and her careful movements spoke of someone nursing various aches and pains. "Okay," Jacob said, settling into a more comfortable position on the hay-strewn floor. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do, but it's getting colder out here, and I suspect you haven't had a real meal in a while. My house is warm, and I make pretty decent pancakes. Sarah always said they were the one thing I couldn't mess up in. The kitchen." He paused, realizing he'd mentioned his deceased wife. It had been happening more lately, these casual references to Sarah, as if she were still there, still part of his daily routine. The grief counselor in Billings had warned him about this, but knowing it was normal didn't make it less painful. "Would you like to come inside and get warmed up?" he continued. "You can leave any time you want. I'm not going to stop you or call anyone or make you do anything. I just hate to see a kid cold and hungry when I've got a warm house and plenty of food." Emma studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to read a foreign language. "Whatever. She saw there must have passed some internal test because she nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. Jacob stood carefully, extending his hand but not expecting her to take it. To his surprise, after a moment's hesitation, she did. Her small hand was ice-cold and trembled in his warm palm. As they walked toward the house, Jacob couldn't help but notice how thin she was, how her shoulder blades protruded sharply beneath the threadbare fabric of her dress. The kitchen was the heart of the Mitchell house, a large room dominated by a cast-iron stove that had been converted to propane years ago, but still radiated heat like its wood-burning ancestors. Copper pots hung from hooks above a butcher block island that Sarah had insisted on installing during one of their rare home improvement phases. The morning sun streamed through gingham curtains, casting everything in warm, golden light. Emma stood just inside the doorway, taking in every detail with the systematic thoroughness of someone cataloguing potential dangers and escape routes. Jacob pretended not to notice her assessment as he moved around the kitchen, gathering ingredients for breakfast. "Why don't you sit down while I get this started?" he suggested, gesturing toward the kitchen table. "There's a bathroom right down. The hall if you need it." Emma remained standing, but she moved closer to the table, close enough to sit if needed, but positioned so she could still reach the door quickly. Jacob appreciated her caution, even as it broke his heart. No child should need to be that careful, that ready to run. As he mixed pancake batter, Jacob found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest. In better light, he could see more details that troubled him. There were faint bruises on her arms, in various stages of healing, suggesting a pattern of abuse rather than accidents. Her hair, while tangled, had been recently cut, chopped short, and uneven, as if someone had done it in a hurry or anger. Most telling were her clothes, which fit poorly and showed signs of hasty alterations, as if they'd been grabbed from whatever was available. But it was her behavior that told the real story. The way she kept one eye on the exits, how she was, startled at sudden movements, the careful way she tested each surface before putting her full weight on it, as if accustomed to furniture that might not be stable. These were the habits of a child who had learned that safety was never guaranteed, that adults were not automatically trustworthy, that survival depended on constant vigilance. "Where are you from, Emma?" Jacob asked, as he heated the griddle, keeping his tone conversational rather than interrogational. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Different places," she answered, which wasn't really an answer at all. "Family?" The shutters came down over her expression immediately. "Don't have any." Jacob recognized a lie when he heard one, but he also recognized the desperation behind it. This wasn't a child who had wandered away from a loving home. This was someone running from something, and whatever she was running from had taught her. That family was not a source of safety. The first pancake sizzled on the griddle, filling the kitchen with the comforting aroma of vanilla and butter. Jacob poured orange juice and set the table for two, movements automatic after decades of domestic routine. He found himself setting out the good plates, the ones with the tiny blue flowers that Sarah had loved, without really thinking about it. "These are almost ready," he said, flipping the golden circles with practiced ease. "You like syrup? I've got real maple syrup. Friend of mine up in Canada sends it down every year." Emma nodded, her eyes fixed on the food with an intensity that made Jacob's chest tight. When he placed the plate in front of her, 3 perfectly round pancakes drizzled with butter and syrup, she stared at it for a moment as if it might disappear. "Go ahead," Jacob encouraged, settling into his own chair with a smaller portion. "Eat up." She ate like someone who expected the food to be taken away at any moment, cutting precise bites and chewing thoroughly, as if trying to make the experience last as long as possible, while simultaneously consuming it as quickly as she could. Jacob ate slowly, pretending not to watch while secretly cataloguing every detail of her behavior. When she finished the first helping, he served her more without being asked. When she finished that, he offered thirds. She accepted each plate with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, as if kindness was a currency she wasn't used to receiving. "Good?" Jacob asked, when she finally leaned back in her chair, the hollow look in her cheeks slightly less pronounced. "Yes, sir," Emma replied, her voice stronger now. "Thank you. You're welcome, sweetheart. Now we need to talk about what happens next." The wariness crept back into her expression immediately. Her body tensed, ready to run. "Easy," Jacob said, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I'm not talking about calling anyone or sending you anywhere, but you can't keep sleeping in my stable. It's October in Montana, and it's only going to get colder. You'll freeze to death out there." Emma's jaw set in a stubborn line that reminded Jacob of his own determination at that age. "I'll be fine." "No, you won't," Jacob said gently but firmly, "and I can't stand by and let a child freeze or starve on my property. That's not happening." They stared at each other across the kitchen table. Two stubborn souls, separated by 50 years and vastly different experiences, but united by the same fundamental determination to survive on their own terms. "I have a proposition," Jacob continued. "There's a spare room upstairs. It's got a bed, a dresser, and a window that faces the mountains. You can stay there, eat regular meals, and in return, you can help me around the ranch. Nothing too strenuous. Feeding chickens, collecting eggs, maybe helping with some light chores. Think of it as a job, if that makes it easier." Emma considered this, her young mind working through the implications and potential traps. "What if I want to leave?" "Then you leave," Jacob said simply. "The door's not locked. You're not a prisoner. But I'd prefer if you gave it a real chance first. Say, a week, and you won't call the police or social services or anyone." Jacob hesitated. His instinct was to make promises he wasn't sure he could keep, but something in Emma's expression told him that honesty was crucial here. "I won't call anyone without talking to you first. But Emma, if you're in danger, if someone's looking for you who might hurt you, I need to know about it. I can't protect you from threats I don't know about." The word protect seemed to catch her attention. She studied his face again with that unsettling intensity, as if trying to determine whether protection was something she could afford to want. "1 week," she said finally. "1 week," Jacob agreed, extending his hand across the table. After a moment's hesitation, Emma shook it. Her grip was firmer now, warmed by food and the heat of the kitchen, but Jacob could still feel the tremor of fear that ran through her small frame like an underground current. As they cleared the breakfast dishes together, Jacob found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Cedar Falls was the kind of town where a rancher taking in a mysterious child would generate talk, and talk led to questions he wasn't sure Emma was ready to answer. But looking at her now, carefully washing plates with the thoroughness of someone who had learned not to waste anything, Jacob knew he'd made the only choice his conscience would allow. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the frost and promising another clear Montana day. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to countless human dramas played out in their shadow. Jacob had lived his entire life in their presence, but somehow, with Emma's arrival, everything felt different. He just hoped he was strong enough for whatever came next. The spare room hadn't been used since Jacob's nephew visited 3 summers ago. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through windows Sarah had hung with pale blue curtains. The double bed was made with military precision, a habit Jacob had never broken from his army days, and the oak dresser still held some of Sarah's books on the top shelf. Emma stood in the doorway, surveying the room with the same methodical assessment she'd applied to everything else. Her fingers traced the doorframe as if memorizing the texture, and Jacob noticed she positioned herself so she could see both the window and the hallway. This was going to be a nursery once, Jacob found himself saying, then immediately regretted it. Some memories were too private to share with a stranger, even a child who needed kindness. But Emma surprised him. What happened? Sarah couldn't have children, Jacob said simply. We tried for years, but it just wasn't meant to be. Emma nodded with the solemn understanding of someone who had learned that life rarely gave people what they wanted most. She stepped into the room and walked to the window, standing on her tiptoes to peer out at the view of the pasture and mountains beyond. It's pretty, she said, and Jacob heard genuine appreciation in her voice for the first time. Sarah used to sit in that chair by the window and read, Jacob continued, gesturing to a worn recliner in the corner. Said the light was perfect in the afternoons. Emma's reflection in the window glass looked fragile against the backdrop of endless sky. Jacob cleared his throat and stepped back into the hallway. I'll let you get settled. There are clothes in the dresser. They might be too big, but they're clean and warm. Bathrooms at the end of the hall. Dinner's at 6, but if you get hungry before then, the kitchen's always open. He was halfway down the stairs when he heard her voice, so quiet he almost missed it. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. The words hit him, harder than they should have. When was the last time someone had thanked him for simple human decency? When had kindness become so rare that a hungry child felt grateful for a warm bed and regular meals? Jacob spent the afternoon doing routine ranch work, but his mind kept drifting to the girl upstairs. Every few minutes, he found himself glancing toward the house, half expecting to see her silhouette disappearing down the road. The rational part of his mind said she'd be gone by morning. Kids like Emma didn't trust easily, and they definitely didn't stick around long enough for adults to start asking uncomfortable questions. But when 6 o'clock came, she appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing a flannel shirt that hung to her knees and jeans rolled up at the cuffs. Her hair was damp from washing, and for the first time, Jacob could see her face clearly. She was prettier than he'd initially realized, with delicate features that would have been beautiful if not for the wariness that shadowed them. "Smells good," she said, hovering near the door as if ready to bolt. Jacob was making his grandmother's beef stew, a recipe that had fed 3 generations of Mitchell men through Montana winters. "Should be ready in a few minutes. You like cornbread?" Emma nodded, settling into the same chair she'd occupied that morning. Jacob noticed she'd chosen the seat with the best view of both exits, old habits from whatever life she was running. As they ate, Jacob attempted casual conversation, asking about her favorite subjects in school, whether she liked animals, what kind of books she read. Emma's answers were careful and vague, designed to reveal nothing about her past while not being outright lies. She was good at it, too good for a child her age, but when Jacob mentioned that he'd taught himself to play guitar during the long winter evenings, something sparked in her eyes. "My mom played piano," she said, then immediately looked stricken, as if the words had escaped without permission. "Played?" Jacob asked gently. Emma's jaw tightened. She plays piano." The correction was too quick, too emphatic. Jacob filed the information away without comment, but the pieces of Emma's story were beginning to form a picture he didn't like. A mother who played piano, past tense corrected to present tense. A child with the survival instincts of someone who'd learned not to trust the adults who were supposed to protect her. After dinner, Emma helped clear the table with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to household chores. When Jacob suggested they watch some television, she declined politely and asked if she could go to her room instead. He found her an hour later, sitting in Sarah's chair by the window, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "Can't sleep?" he asked from the doorway. "Not used to it being so quiet," Emma admitted. Where I was before, there was always noise. Cars, people yelling, music playing too loud." "City?" She nodded reluctantly. Las Vegas." Jacob had been there once, passing through on his way to California for Sarah's cousin's wedding. He remembered the noise, the crowds, the feeling that nothing ever stopped moving or shut down. It was as different from Cedar Falls as Mars was from Earth. Long way from home, he observed. This isn't home, Emma said quickly. I mean, I'm just staying for a week. Like we agreed. Right, Jacob said. Just a week. But as he watched her silhouette against the darkening sky, something told him that a week wasn't going to be nearly enough time to untangle whatever had brought Emma Mitchell into his life. The next morning brought the first real test of their arrangement. Jacob was mucking out Buck's stall when he heard the rumble of an engine coming up the long gravel drive. He straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead, and saw the familiar white pickup truck of Frank Thompson from the general store. Frank climbed out of his truck with the deliberate movements of a man whose arthritis was acting up. At 72, he was one of the few people in Cedar Falls older than Jacob, and his opinion carried weight in the community. He was also incurably curious, and had never met a piece of gossip he couldn't spread. "Morning, Jacob," Frank called out, his eyes already scanning the ranch for signs of whatever had brought him out here. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you're getting along." Frank Thompson had never in his life stopped by just to see how anyone was getting along. Jacob leaned against the pitchfork and prepared for whatever fishing expedition was about to begin. "Doing fine, Frank. What brings you out this way?" "Well, funny thing happened yesterday. My nephew Dale was driving past your place around 7 in the morning. He works the early shift at the mine, you know, and he swore he saw someone walking from your stable to the house. Someone small, said it looked like a kid." Jacob's expression didn't change, but internally he was calculating. Dale Thompson was Frank's great-nephew, a reliable kid who worked hard and didn't have much imagination. If Dale said he saw something, he probably did. Jacob said non-committally. "Now, I told Dale he was probably seeing things," Frank continued, his tone suggesting he believed no such thing. "I mean, what would a kid be doing out here at dawn? But then I got to thinking, and I realized I haven't seen you in town much lately. Usually you come by the store every few days for supplies." This was true. Jacob normally made regular trips to town for groceries, hardware, and the kind of casual social interaction that kept a widower from becoming a complete hermit. But since Emma's arrival 3 days ago, he'd been reluctant to leave the ranch. "Been busy with ranch work," Jacob said. "Always plenty to do at this time of year." Frank nodded as if this made perfect sense, but his eyes continued to roam the property. "Course, if you had a visitor, especially a young visitor, well, that would explain why you might be staying close to home. Kids need looking after." The two men stared at each other across the barnyard, engaged in the kind of conversational chess match that small-town folks perfected over decades of practice. Frank was fishing for information. Jacob was determined not to give him any. Both men understood the rules of the game perfectly. "Can't say I've had any visitors lately," Jacob said, which was technically true if you didn't count finding someone in your stable as having a visitor. Frank's disappointed expression suggested he'd hoped for a more illuminating response. "Well, if you do happen to have a young guest, you know the community's always ready to help, especially with school starting up again. Kids need their education." This was a not-so-subtle warning. If there was a school-age child on Jacob's property, the authorities would eventually need to be involved. Education was compulsory, and truancy officers had long memories. "I'll keep that in mind," Jacob said. Frank lingered another few minutes, making small talk about the weather and the price of cattle, but his heart wasn't in it. He'd come looking for confirmation of his nephew's story and hadn't gotten it. As he climbed back into his truck, Jacob could practically see the gears turning in the old man's head. From the house came the faint sound of a door closing. Emma, had been watching from the window, and she'd probably heard every word of the conversation. When Jacob entered the kitchen a few minutes later, he found her sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that was mostly milk and sugar. "He knows I'm here," she said without preamble. "He suspects," Jacob corrected. "That's different from knowing." "Not by much." Emma's fingers drummed against the coffee mug, a nervous habit Jacob was beginning to recognize. "I should go." "Where?" The simple question seemed to catch her off guard. Her mouth opened and closed a few times before she managed to speak. "Somewhere else. Away from here. I don't want to cause you trouble." "What kind of trouble are you running from, Emma?" She was quiet, for so long that Jacob thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, the kind that doesn't go away just because you want it to. Jacob sat down across from her, studying her face in the morning light. The bruises on her arms were fading but still visible, and he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself as if expecting a blow. "Someone hurt you," he said. It wasn't a question. Emma's knuckles went white around the coffee mug. "My mom's boyfriend, Ray. He gets angry sometimes, and when he drinks, he gets really angry." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for so long that they'd built up pressure like steam in a kettle. Once she started talking, she couldn't seem to stop. "Mum tries to keep him calm, but nothing works. He hits her, and sometimes he hits me. Last week he threw a bottle at my head, and I had to get stitches." She pushed her hair back, revealing a partially healed cut above her left ear. "Mum said I fell down, but the doctor knew. I could tell by the way he looked at us." Jacob's hands clenched into fists under the table. In all his years, through war and loss and the general cruelties of life, nothing had ever made him angrier than the image of a grown man terrorizing a child. "Where's your mom now?" he asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Still with him. She says she can't leave because she doesn't have anywhere to go, doesn't have any money. But I think she's scared of what he'll do if she tries." Emma's eyes filled with tears she angrily wiped away. "I told her we could figure it out together, but she said it was too dangerous, so I left. I took some money from her purse and got on a bus. I was trying to get to my aunt in Colorado, but I didn't have enough for the whole ticket." "So you got off the bus here?" Emma shook her head. "2 towns over, in Millfield. But there were people asking questions at the bus station, and I got scared they were looking for me, so I started walking. I've been walking for 4 days. 4 days. A child walking alone across Montana in October, sleeping wherever she could, and find shelter, eating whatever she could scrounge or steal." The thought made Jacob's chest ache. "Emma, honey, your mom's probably worried sick about you." "No, she's not," Emma said with devastating certainty. "She's probably relieved. One less thing for Ray to get mad about." The matter-of-fact way she said it was somehow worse than if she'd been crying. This wasn't self-pity or dramatic exaggeration. This was a child stating what she believed to be a simple fact, that her own mother saw her as a burden. Jacob got up and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains while he processed what Emma had told him. Every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to call the authorities, to get this child into the system where trained professionals could handle her case properly. But he'd seen enough of the system during his volunteer work at the VA hospital to know that sometimes official help wasn't helpful at all. "What do you want to happen, Emma?" he asked without turning around. "I want to disappear," she said simply. "I want to go somewhere Ray can never find me, and I want to never be scared again." Jacob turned to face her, this small, damaged child, who had somehow found her way to his ranch and into his life. She looked so young, sitting at his kitchen table, but her eyes held an old soul's weariness that no child should possess. "Disappearing isn't as easy as it sounds," he said gently, "and it's not always the answer." "Then what is?" Jacob wished he knew. He wished Sarah were there to offer the kind of wisdom and comfort that had always come so naturally to her. He wished He were the kind of man who always knew the right thing to do, but he wasn't that man. He was just a lonely rancher who had stumbled into a situation that was far more complicated than anything he'd ever faced. All he had was his instinct, and his instinct was telling him that Emma needed more than just a warm bed and regular meals. She needed someone to prove that not all adults were sources of pain and fear. "I don't know what the answer is," Jacob admitted, "but I know what it isn't. It isn't a 10-year-old girl trying to survive on her own. It isn't giving up and running away every time someone gets curious. And it definitely isn't going back to a situation where you're not safe." Emma's expression shifted, hope and skepticism warring in her features. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we extend that week-long arrangement of ours, give ourselves more time to figure things out. And if people ask questions," Jacob thought about Frank Thompson's visit, about the inevitable gossip that would follow, about the complications that would arise when the school district realized there was an unregistered child in their jurisdiction. "Then we'll deal with the questions when they come," he said, "together." For the first time since he'd found her in the stable, Emma smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it transformed her entire face. "Together," she repeated, as if testing the word. "Together," Jacob confirmed. Outside, the Montana sky stretched endlessly blue above the ranch, and the mountains stood as eternal witnesses to human struggles and triumphs. Jacob had lived in their shadow his entire life, but he'd never felt their presence as keenly as he did in that moment when he made a promise to a damaged child that he hoped he would be strong enough to keep. The phone call came at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning, just as Jacob was teaching Emma how to properly saddle Buck. The old gelding had taken a surprising shine to her, standing patient and still while she fumbled with the cinch straps under Jacob's patient guidance. "Let it ring," Jacob said, when the phone's shrill tone echoed from the house. "Whoever it is can wait." But Emma had frozen at the sound, her face pale beneath the brim of one of Sarah's old riding helmets. The confidence she'd been building over the past 2 weeks evaporated instantly, replaced by the hunted look Jacob had hoped was disappearing for good. "What if it's about me?" she whispered. Jacob studied her expression and made a decision that would change everything. "Then we'll deal with it, but I'm not leaving you out here alone." They walked to the house together, Emma staying close enough to Jacob that their shoulders almost touched. The answering machine had picked up by the time they reached the kitchen, and Sheriff David Patterson's gravelly voice filled the room. "Jacob, it's Dave Patterson. Need to talk to you about something. Give me a call when you get this message. It's not urgent, but it's important." Emma sank into a kitchen chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight. "He knows. They found me." "We don't know that," Jacob said, though his own stomach had knotted at the sheriff's formal tone. Dave Patterson had been a friend for over 30 years, but that had been Sheriff Patterson on the phone, not Dave. Jacob had served in Vietnam with Dave's older brother, and they'd maintained an easy friendship over the decades. Dave was a man fair and sensible, but he was also sworn to uphold the law. If he'd received an official inquiry about a missing child, he'd have to act on it. "I should run," Emma said, already starting to rise from her chair. "No." Jacob's voice was firm enough to stop her. "Running is what got you sleeping in my stable half-starved. Running is what landed you walking alone on highways for 4 days. We're not running anymore. But if they make me go back, they won't." The certainty in Jacob's voice surprised even him. "I won't let that happen." Emma searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her, because she settled back into her chair and nodded. Jacob picked up the phone and dialed the sheriff's office. Dave answered on the second ring. "Sheriff Patterson." "Dave, it's Jacob Mitchell. Got your message." Jacob, thanks for calling back. Listen, I need to ask you something, and I'd appreciate a straight answer. Here it comes, Jacob thought. Shoot. You have a kid staying out at your place? Jacob looked at Emma, who was watching him with the intensity of someone whose entire future hung on his next words. Why do you ask? Because I got a call yesterday from Las Vegas Metro Police. They're looking for a runaway girl, 10 years old. Been missing for about 3 weeks now. Name's Emma Rodriguez. Not the name she'd given him, but then again, Jacob had suspected she hadn't told him everything. Emma's eyes went wide when she heard it, confirming his suspicion. They have reason to believe she might have headed this direction, Dave continued. Bought a bus ticket to somewhere in Montana. Thing is, Jacob, Frank Thompson's been spreading stories around town about seeing a child at your ranch. Normally, I'd tell Frank to mind his own business, but with this official inquiry, you have to check it out, Jacob finished. I'm afraid. So I can be out there in an hour, or you can bring her into town. Your choice. Jacob closed his eyes and made the decision that would either save Emma or destroy any chance she had of staying safe. We'll come to you. Give us an hour. Jacob, 1 hour, Dave. I'll explain everything then. He hung up before the sheriff could respond and turned to find Emma staring at him with a mixture of betrayal and terror. You're turning me in, she said flatly. I'm buying us time, Jacob corrected. There's a difference. Emma shook her head violently. You don't understand. If they send me back, Ray will... They're not sending you back. Jacob knelt in front of her chair, taking her small hands in his weathered ones. Emma, listen to me. Dave Patterson is a good man. He's also smart enough to know that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing. But if we hide from him now, if we make him come looking for us, then we lose any chance of controlling this situation. What if you're wrong? What if he doesn't care about what Ray did to me? Then we'll figure out Plan B, Jacob said simply. But Emma, honey, we can't keep hiding forever. Sooner or later, someone was going to start asking questions. At least this way, we get to tell our side of the story. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her mind working through possibilities and escape routes. Finally, she looked up at Jacob with eyes that seemed far too old for her face. If this goes bad, if they try to send me back, will you help me run? Jacob hesitated. What she was asking could land him in federal prison, interfering with a law enforcement investigation, harboring a runaway minor, possibly kidnapping charges. If the wrong prosecutor got involved. He thought about his quiet life, his peaceful ranch, the simple routine that had sustained him through 5 years of loneliness. Then he looked at Emma's bruised arms, remembered the terror in her voice when she talked about Ray, thought about what kind of man could terrorize a child and the woman who should have protected her. If it comes to that, he said, yes, I'll help you run. Emma squeezed his hands tightly. Thank you. They drove to town in Jacob's pickup. Emma huddled against the passenger door, despite the warm afternoon sun. As they passed through Cedar Falls, tiny downtown, Jacob could see curtains twitching in windows and people pausing their conversations to stare at his truck. News traveled fast in small towns, and everyone probably knew by now that Sheriff Patterson was expecting visitors. The Cedar Falls Sheriff's Office occupied half of a low brick building that also housed the town clerk and the volunteer fire department. Jacob had been there countless times over the years for various civic functions, but today it felt different. Today he was walking into a confrontation that could change Emma's life forever. Sheriff Patterson was waiting for them in his small office, still wearing the same serious expression Jacob had heard in his voice. Dave was a big man, 6'4", and built like the linebacker he'd been in high school, but he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that his size could be intimidating. Emma? Dave asked gently, focusing on the girl who stood slightly behind Jacob. She nodded but didn't speak. I'm Sheriff Patterson. You can call me Dave if you want. Why don't you both sit down, and we'll see if we can sort this out." They settled into the two chairs facing Dave's desk. Emma perched on the edge of hers, ready to bolt, while Jacob tried to project a calm he didn't feel. "Okay," Dave said, opening a thin file folder. "Let's start with what I know. 3 weeks ago, Elena Rodriguez filed a missing person report with Las Vegas Metro Police regarding her daughter, Emma Rodriguez, age 10. According to the mother, Emma ran away from home following a family dispute. The family has been cooperating with the investigation, and they want Emma returned home safely." Emma made a small sound of distress at the mention of her mother's name. Jacob reached over and took her hand. "Now," Dave continued, "what I'd like to know is how Emma ended up here and what's been happening since she arrived." Jacob took a deep breath and began talking. He told Dave about finding Emma in the stable, about her condition when he discovered her, about the signs of abuse he'd observed. He described their conversations, Emma's fear of returning home, and his own growing conviction that sending her back would be tantamount to signing her death warrant. Throughout his recitation, Dave listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but mostly just absorbing the information. When Jacob finished, the sheriff turned his attention to Emma. "Emma, is what Mr. Mitchell said accurate? About why you left home, about someone hurting you?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper when she answered, "Yes, sir. Can you tell me about that?" For a moment, Jacob thought she might refuse to answer. Then, in halting sentences punctuated by long pauses, Emma began to describe life with Ray. She talked about the drinking, the violence, the way her mother seemed to disappear inside herself whenever Ray's temper flared. She described the night. She'd been hit with the bottle, the lies told to the doctor, the growing certainty that things would only get worse. Dave listened to it all with the patient attention of someone who had heard too many similar stories over the years. When Emma finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring at the file folder as if it might contain answers to questions that had no good solutions. "Emma," he said finally, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you want to go home?" "No," Emma said immediately. "Please don't make me go back." "What do you want to happen?" Emma glanced at Jacob, then back at the sheriff. "I want to stay with Mr. Mitchell. He's been kind to me. He makes me feel safe." Dave nodded slowly, then looked at Jacob. "And you? What do you want to happen here?" "I want Emma to be safe," Jacob said simply. "If that means she stays with me, then that's what I want. If there's another solution that keeps her safe, I'm open to hearing it. But I won't be party to sending her back to a situation where she's being abused." The sheriff closed the file folder and leaned back in his chair. "Gentlemen and lady, we have ourselves a situation here. Legally speaking, Emma is a minor who belongs with her legal guardian, which is her mother. I have an official request to return her to Las Vegas if she's found." Emma's grip on Jacob's hand tightened painfully. "However," Dave continued, "I also have credible allegations of child abuse, which triggers a whole different set of legal obligations. I can't in good conscience send a child back to a dangerous situation without a thorough investigation." "What does that mean?" Jacob asked. "It means I'm going to make some phone calls. I need to talk to Las Vegas Metro, find out more about this Ray character, see if there have been any domestic violence calls to the Rodriguez address. I also need to contact Child Protective Services, both here and in Nevada." "CPS," Emma's voice was strained. "Will they take me away?" Dave's expression softened. "Not if I can help it, sweetheart. But understand, this is bigger than just what any of us wants. There are laws designed to protect children, and sometimes those laws are complicated." He turned back to Jacob. "In the meantime, I'm comfortable with Emma staying at your ranch, provided you're willing to accept temporary guardianship responsibilities." That means making sure she's enrolled in school, that she gets proper medical care, that you follow all the legal requirements for caring for a minor. School. Emma looked panicked. But people will ask questions. People are already asking. Questions, Dave pointed out gently. Frank Thompson isn't the only one who's noticed a new face around town. If you're going to stay here, even temporarily, you need to start living like a normal kid. That means school. Jacob could see the terror in Emma's eyes at the prospect of being around other children, of having to answer questions about where she came from and why she was living with a man who wasn't her relative. But he could also see something else. A tiny spark of hope at the idea of normal things like school and friends and a life that didn't revolve around fear. What about her mother? Jacob asked. What happens when she finds out Emma's been found? That's going to be the tricky part, Dave admitted. Elena Rodriguez has legal rights as Emma's mother. Even if Ray is abusive, that doesn't automatically terminate her parental rights. But if I can build a case showing that she failed to protect Emma from a known threat, that changes things. They talked for another hour, working through the legal complexities and practical challenges ahead. By the time they left the sheriff's office, Emma had been enrolled in Cedar Falls Elementary School, scheduled for a medical examination with Dr. Sarah Chen, and assigned a caseworker from the State Department of Family Services. As they drove back to the ranch, Emma was uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, as they turned into the long gravel driveway, she spoke. Do you think it'll work? Do you think I'll really get to stay? Jacob looked at her small profile silhouetted against the passenger window. This brave, damaged child who had somehow become the most important thing in his world. I think Sheriff Patterson is going to do everything he can to make sure you're safe, Jacob said carefully, and I think that's the best we can hope for right now. Emma nodded, accepting the uncertainty with the resignation of someone who had learned not to expect guarantees from life. But as they pulled up to the house, she surprised Jacob by reaching over and squeezing his hand. Whatever happens, she said, thank you for not giving up on me. Jacob squeezed back, his throat tight with emotions he couldn't name. Never, he said quietly. I'll never give up on you. As they walked toward the house together, the mountains stood witness to a promise that would be tested in ways neither of them could imagine. But for now, in this moment, it was enough that they faced the uncertainty together, a lonely rancher and a lost child who had found something in each other that neither had dared to hope for. The first battle was over. The war for Emma's future was just beginning. Emma's first day at Cedar Falls Elementary School arrived with an early October blizzard that coated the mountains in fresh snow and turned the morning air sharp enough to cut glass. Jacob watched, her push eggs around her plate at breakfast, her appetite vanishing with each tick of the kitchen clock. You don't have to eat if you're not hungry, he said gently. I'm not really hungry, Emma admitted. My stomach feels weird. That's normal. First day anywhere is scary. Emma looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much for someone her age. What if the other kids ask questions I can't answer? What if they figure out I'm not supposed to be here? Jacob set down his coffee mug and studied her face. Over the past month, she'd grown more confident around the ranch, helping with chores, and even laughing occasionally at his terrible jokes. But the prospect of facing a classroom full of curious 10-year-olds had brought back the haunted look he'd hoped was disappearing forever. Emma, you have every right to be here. Sheriff Patterson made that official. You're enrolled, you have all your paperwork, and Dr. Chen cleared you medically. You belong here as much as any other kid. But what do I tell them about my family, about where I came from? Jacob had been dreading this question. They'd practiced various versions of the truth, that she was staying with him while her family situation got sorted out, that her mother was dealing with some problems and couldn't take care of her right now. All technically accurate, but none of it felt adequate when faced with the curiosity of children. You tell them what feels right, Jacob said finally. You don't owe anyone your whole story, Emma. Not the kids, not the teachers, not anybody. Your business is your business. Emma nodded, but Jacob could see the anxiety still coiled tight in her shoulders. He made a decision that surprised them. Both. Would it help if I walked you to your classroom? Just for today? Relief flooded Emma's face. You'd do that? Course I would. Cedar Falls Elementary School was a single-story brick building that had been constructed in the 1960s and showed every year of its age. The hallways smelled like industrial cleaning solution and childhood memories, a combination that hit Jacob with unexpected nostalgia. He'd walked these same halls 30 years ago when he'd volunteered for a reading program Sarah had talked him into. Principal Margaret Foster met them at the main office, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades managing both children and their parents. She shook Emma's hand with genuine warmth. Welcome to Cedar Falls Elementary, Emma. We're so glad to have you here. Emma managed a shy smile. Thank you, Mom. Your teacher is Mrs. Anderson, and she's wonderful. She's been teaching 5th grade for 15 years, and I think you're going to like her very much. As they walked down the hallway toward Emma's classroom, Jacob noticed how other students stared, not maliciously, but with the frank curiosity of children encountering something new in their familiar world. Emma moved closer to him, her shoulder brushing his arm. Mrs. Anderson turned out to be a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an easy smile. She welcomed Emma warmly and introduced her to the class as their new student who would be living with Mr. Mitchell on his ranch outside town. The other children accepted this explanation without question, as children do. They were more interested in whether Emma had ever ridden a horse, and if she'd seen any bears on the ranch, than in the complexities of her living situation. Jacob stayed long enough to see Emma settle into a desk next to a friendly girl named Katie Morrison, then quietly slipped out. As he drove back to the ranch, he found himself thinking about how normal it had all seemed. Just a new student starting school, just a man dropping off a child in his care. For a few minutes, they'd been an ordinary family doing ordinary things. The illusion shattered when he arrived home to find a black sedan with government plates parked in his driveway. The woman standing on his front porch was tall and thin, with short brown hair and the kind of severe expression that suggested she'd seen too much of humanity's failures. She wore a navy blue suit and carried a briefcase that looked like it weighed as much as she did. Mr. Mitchell, I'm Janet Sterling, Montana Department of Family Services. I believe Sheriff Patterson mentioned I'd be coming by. Jacob's stomach sank. He'd known this was coming, but knowing and being ready were two different things. Miss Sterling, please come in. The caseworker's eyes swept over the kitchen as they entered, taking inventory with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to spot problems. Jacob tried to see his home through her eyes, the clean but worn furniture, the carefully maintained but aging appliances, the photographs of Sarah that still decorated the walls. "Where is Emma?" Miss Sterling asked, settling into a chair at the kitchen table and opening her briefcase. "School. Today's her first day." "And how is she adjusting to living here?" Jacob poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked, using the time to consider his answer. Everything he said would be noted, analyzed, and potentially used to determine Emma's future. She's doing well, better every day. She helps with chores around the ranch. She's been eating regularly, sleeping through the night. She seems more relaxed. Miss Sterling made notes on a yellow legal pad. "Tell me about the living arrangements. Where does she sleep?" "Upstairs bedroom. It's got its own dresser, good natural light, faces the mountains. She likes the view. And supervision. You work a ranch, Mr. Mitchell. That's physical labor, often dangerous. How do you ensure Emma's safety during your work hours?" The question was fair, but Jacob bristled at the implication. Emma's not left unsupervised. When I'm doing anything potentially dangerous, she either helps with safer tasks or stays in the house. She's a smart kid, smarter than most adults I know. She understands. Ranch safety. More notes. What about socialization? Friends her own age. That's what school's for. And she gets along well with the animals, which is good for kids. Teaches responsibility and empathy. Miss Sterling looked up from her notepad. Mr. Mitchell, I have to ask, why are you doing this? You're a single man with no children of your own. No family obligation to Emma. Most people would have called Child Protective Services immediately and let the system handle it. Jacob stared out the kitchen window at the mountains while he considered how to answer. How could he explain that finding Emma had felt like discovering a missing piece of himself he hadn't known was lost? How could he describe the way her laughter had brought life back to a house that had felt like a tomb since Sarah's death? She needed help, he said simply. I was in a position to provide it. It's more complicated than that, though, isn't it? You're asking to become her temporary guardian. That's a significant legal and financial responsibility. I understand that. Do you, Mr. Mitchell? Emma has been traumatized. She's been abused, neglected, and separated from her mother. Children who've experienced that kind of trauma often have behavioral problems, emotional issues, difficulties in school. Are you prepared to deal with those challenges? Jacob turned back to face the caseworker. Ms. Sterling, what exactly are you asking me? I'm asking if you've thought this through. Beyond the immediate crisis, Emma needs stability, consistency, and professional support. She needs someone who understands child development and trauma recovery. With all due respect, you're a cattle rancher, not a child psychologist. The criticism stung because it contained a grain of truth. Jacob wasn't trained in childhood trauma or adolescent psychology. He didn't have a degree in social work or experience raising damaged children. All he had was instinct, determination, and a growing love for a girl who had wandered into his life by accident. You're right, he said. I don't have training or degrees or professional experience, but I have something else. I care about what happens to Emma, not as a case file or a statistic, but as a person. I see her every day, watch her eat breakfast, help her with homework, listen to her nightmares. I know that she's afraid of loud noises and closed doors, that she checks the locks on the windows before she goes to bed, that she still flinches sometimes when I move too quickly. Jacob's voice grew stronger as he continued. I also know that she's incredibly bright, that she has a gift with animals, that she laughs when Buck tries to steal apples from her pockets. I know she's brave and strong and deserves a chance to be a normal kid. If that's not enough qualification, then I don't know what is. Miss Sterling studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The system is designed to protect children, Mr. Mitchell. Sometimes that means making difficult decisions that don't feel fair to the adults involved. And sometimes, Jacob said quietly, the system fails children by treating them like problems to be solved instead of people to be loved. They were interrupted by the sound of a car in the driveway. Through the window, Jacob saw Sheriff Patterson's patrol car pulling up beside the government sedan. A moment later, Dave Patterson knocked on the front door. Jacob, Miss Sterling, Dave said as he entered the kitchen. His expression was grim. We need to talk. Miss Sterling looked up from her notepad. Sheriff, I'm in the middle of conducting an evaluation. This can't wait, Dave interrupted. I just got off the phone with Las Vegas Metro Police. They've completed their investigation into the Rodriguez household. Jacob felt his stomach drop. And? Ray Valdez, that's the boyfriend's full name, has a record: domestic violence, assault, public intoxication. 3 different women have filed complaints against him over the past 5 years. 2 of those cases were dropped when the women refused to testify, but the 3rd resulted in a conviction. Emma's mother had sent her daughter back to live with a man with a criminal record of violence against women. The thought made Jacob feel sick. "There's more," Dave continued. "Las Vegas PD did a welfare check at the Rodriguez apartment yesterday. Elena Rodriguez was treated at the emergency room 2 weeks ago for a broken wrist and facial bruises. She told the hospital she fell downstairs, but the injury pattern was consistent with defensive wounds and blunt force trauma." The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the wall clock and the distant sound of wind through the eaves. Jacob thought about Emma in her classroom, trying to concentrate on math problems and spelling tests, while her mother was being beaten by the same man who had terrorized them both. Miss Sterling was the first to speak. "What does this mean for Emma's case?" "It means," Sheriff Patterson said grimly, "that Elena Rodriguez is not currently in a position to provide a safe home for her daughter. Ray Valdez is still living in the apartment, and there's no indication that Ms. Rodriguez has any intention of leaving him." "So Emma stays here?" Jacob asked. "For now," Miss Sterling said carefully, "but this doesn't resolve the larger question of permanent placement. Mrs. Rodriguez is still Emma's legal guardian, and unless she voluntarily relinquishes her parental rights or those rights are terminated by a court, she has the legal authority to reclaim her daughter. Even knowing what we know about the abuse? Even then, the system gives parents tremendous latitude to maintain custody of their children, even in less than ideal circumstances. The standard for terminating parental rights is very high." Jacob felt the walls closing in. After everything they'd been through, after Emma had finally started to feel safe and normal, she could still be forced to return to the very situation she'd risked her life to escape. "There is one option," Ms. Sterling continued slowly. "If Mrs. Rodriguez could be persuaded to sign a voluntary custody relinquishment, that would clear the way for formal adoption proceedings." Adoption? The word hit Jacob like a physical blow. He'd been thinking in terms of temporary guardianship, of helping Emma until her situation stabilized. Adoption was permanent. Adoption was forever. It would be the safest legal option for Emma, Sheriff Patterson said. Full parental rights, permanent placement, no possibility of the mother changing her mind later. Jacob thought about Emma sitting in her new classroom, making friends with Katie Morrison, learning to trust that adults could be safe and reliable. He thought about her laughter echoing through the house, about the way she'd started calling it home instead of your place. He thought about the rest of his life, not just the next few months or years, but decades. High school graduation, college applications, wedding planning, grandchildren. A future that would be forever intertwined with this brave, damaged girl who had stumbled into his stable and changed everything. What would that involve? He heard himself asking. Home studies, background checks, financial assessments, psychological evaluations, Ms. Sterling recited. The process typically takes 6 to 12 months, assuming no complications. And Emma. How does she fit into this decision? She's old enough that her preferences would be taken into consideration by the court, but ultimately it would depend on what's determined to be in her best interests. Through the kitchen window, Jacob could see the school bus making its way up the mountain road toward town. In a few hours, Emma would be walking through his front door, eager to tell him about her first day of school. She'd ask about homework and dinner plans, and whether Buck had missed her while she was gone. She'd be trusting him to keep her safe, to keep the promises he'd made, to be the kind of adult who didn't let her down. If Elena Rodriguez agreed to relinquish custody, Jacob said slowly, and if all the evaluations and studies went well, Emma could stay here permanently? Yes, Miss Sterling said, she could stay here permanently. Jacob looked out at the mountains that had watched over his family for 4 generations, thinking about the future he'd never dared to imagine and the choice that would define the rest of his life. When Emma came home that afternoon, bubbling with stories about her new teacher and the friend she'd made at lunch, Jacob listened with a smile and kept his momentous decision to himself. Some conversations required careful timing, and some promises were too important to make lightly. Even when your heart had already decided, the call came at 3 in the morning, jerking Jacob from the deepest sleep he'd had in weeks. He fumbled for the phone in the darkness, his heart already racing with the certainty that middle-of-the-night calls never brought good news. "Mr. Mitchell?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional, with the careful neutrality of someone trained to deliver difficult information. "This is Detective Maria Santos with Las Vegas Metropolitan Police. I'm calling regarding Elena Rodriguez." Jacob sat up in bed, instantly awake. "What's happened?" "Mrs. Rodriguez was admitted to University Medical Center approximately 4 hours. Ago with severe injuries. She's in critical condition." The words hit Jacob like ice water. Raymond Valdez is in custody. He's been charged with attempted murder, aggravated assault, and domestic violence. Mrs. Rodriguez is alive, but... The detective paused. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to ask you about Emma Rodriguez. Our records show she's been missing for over a month. Is she safe?" "She's safe," Jacob said, his mind racing. "She's here with me in Montana. Sheriff Patterson can confirm that." "Good. That's very good." Because Mrs. Rodriguez's first coherent words when she regained consciousness were asking if Emma was okay. "She's been very concerned that Mr. Valdez might try to find her." Jacob glanced toward the hallway, where Emma's bedroom door remained closed. She didn't need to hear this conversation, didn't need to know that her worst fears about what Ray might do to her mother had come true. "Detective Santos, what exactly happened?" According to neighbors, there was a violent altercation at the Rodriguez apartment around 10 p.m. Multiple residents called 911 reporting screaming and sounds of breaking glass. When officers arrived, they found Mrs. Rodriguez unconscious with significant head trauma and several broken bones. Mr. Valdez was intoxicated and belligerent, and he resisted arrest. Jacob closed his eyes, imagining the scene. Emma's mother, trapped in that apartment with a man whose violence had finally escalated beyond beatings to something that nearly killed her. Is she going to recover? It's too early to say definitively. She has a traumatic brain injury, and the doctors are still assessing the extent of the damage. But Mr. Mitchell, there's something else you need to know. Mrs. Rodriguez has been asking to speak with Emma. That's not possible right now? I understand your concerns, but she's been very insistent. She says she has something important to tell her daughter. Something about custody arrangements. Jacob's pulse quickened. Could Elena Rodriguez finally be ready to do what she should have done months ago? What kind of custody arrangements? She didn't elaborate, and the doctors have limited her conversations due to her condition. But she's been asking specifically for legal representation, and she's mentioned wanting to ensure Emma's safety. After ending the call, Jacob sat in his darkened bedroom for a long time, processing the implications. Ray Valdez was finally behind bars, which eliminated the immediate physical threat to both Emma and her mother. But Elena Rodriguez's injuries changed everything. Even if she survived and recovered fully, she would need months of rehabilitation. She couldn't provide a home for Emma anytime soon, even if she wanted to. More importantly, this incident might finally give her the motivation to make the legal changes that would ensure Emma's permanent safety. The next morning brought the challenge of explaining the situation to Emma without traumatizing her further. Jacob found her in the kitchen, already dressed for school and eating cereal while reading one of Sarah's old novels. "Morning, sunshine," he said, trying to keep his voice normal. "Morning. You look tired. Did you sleep okay?" Emma's perceptiveness continued to surprise him. She'd become attuned to his moods and expressions in the way that children do when their security depends on reading adult emotions correctly. "I got a phone call last night," Jacob said carefully, settling into the chair across from her. "About your mother." Emma's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. "Is she okay?" "She's in the hospital. She was hurt, but she's alive, and the doctors are taking good care of her." "Ray?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "He's in jail. He can't hurt anyone anymore." Emma set down her spoon and stared at her cereal bowl. Jacob could see her processing the information, working through the implications with the sobering maturity of someone who had learned to expect the worst. "Is she going to die?" Emma asked quietly. "The doctors don't think so. But she's hurt pretty badly, and it's going to take time for her to get better." Emma nodded, her expression unreadable. "She asked me to leave with her so many times. I kept telling her we could get away from him together, but she always said it was too dangerous. Maybe if I'd stayed—" "Emma," Jacob's voice was firm enough to cut through her self-recrimination. "This is not your fault. Nothing that happened to your mother is your fault. You were a child trying to survive in an impossible situation. You made the only choice you could. But maybe I could have protected." "Ha, sweetheart. It wasn't your job to protect your mother. That's what adults are supposed to do for children, not the other way around." Emma was quiet for a long moment, absently stirring her cereal while she thought. Finally, she looked up at Jacob with eyes that seemed older than her 10 years. "Does this mean I have to go back now, to Las Vegas?" "No," Jacob said without hesitation. "Your mother can't take care of you right now, and Ray is in jail where he belongs. You're staying here. For how long?" It was the question Jacob had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The conversation with Detective Santos had crystallized something that had been building in his mind for weeks. Emma wasn't just a temporary responsibility anymore. She was family. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." She nodded, giving him her full attention. "How would you feel about staying here permanently, not just until your mother gets better, but for good, making this your real home?" Emma's eyes widened. "You mean like adoption?" "Yes, like adoption. It would mean I'd be your legal father and you'd be my daughter, forever." The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the wall clock and the distant sound of wind through the trees. Emma stared at Jacob as if trying to determine whether he was serious, whether this was something she was allowed to want. "Would I have to change my name?" she asked finally. "Only if you wanted to. You could be Emma Mitchell, or you could stay Emma Rodriguez, or you could hyphenate it. Whatever felt right to you." "Emma Mitchell," she said slowly, testing the sound. "That sounds nice. Does that mean you'd want to stay permanently?" Emma's answer came without hesitation. "Yes, more than anything." The relief Jacob felt was so intense it was almost physical. He'd been prepared for uncertainty, for her needing time to think, for complications and conditions. He hadn't expected the simple, wholehearted acceptance of a child who had finally found the safety she'd been searching for. "There are going to be a lot of legal steps," he warned her. "Paperwork, interviews, home studies, and we'd need your mother's permission." "Do you think she'll say yes?" Jacob thought about Elena Rodriguez lying in a hospital bed, asking about custody arrangements and legal representation. "I think she wants you to be safe more than anything else. And I think she knows that staying with me is the safest place for you." Emma slipped out of her chair and came around the table to hug him. It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact, and Jacob felt his throat tighten with emotion as her small arms wrapped around his shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered in his ear, "for everything." Jacob hugged her back, thinking about the scared, starving child he'd found in his stable just 2 months ago, and the confident, happy girl she was becoming. "Thank you for letting me be your dad." The conversation with Elena Rodriguez came 3 days later, facilitated by Detective Santos and conducted via video call due to Elena's injuries. Jacob and Emma sat in Sheriff Patterson's office, with Janet Sterling present to observe and document the proceedings. Elena Rodriguez looked fragile on the computer screen, her face swollen and bandaged, her left arm in a cast. But her eyes were alert and focused as she looked at her daughter for the first time in over 2 months. "Mija," she said softly, and Emma leaned forward toward the screen. "Hi, Mama. Are you okay?" "I'm getting better, baby. The doctors say I'm going to be fine." Elena's voice was hoarse but determined. "Emma, I need to tell you something important. I need to ask you to forgive me. Mama, let me finish, please. I failed you. I let Ray hurt you, and I let him scare you so badly that you felt like you had to run away. I was supposed to protect you, and instead I chose him over you. I'm so sorry, Mija. I'm so sorry." Tears were streaming down Emma's face, but she didn't interrupt. "I've been talking to lawyers and to the police and to the doctors here," Elena continued. "Ray is going to prison for a long time. But even when I get out of the hospital, even when I'm completely better, I don't think I can give you the kind of life you deserve." Emma glanced at Jacob, then back at the screen. "What are you saying, Mama?" "I'm saying that Mr. Mitchell loves you. I can see it in how he looks at you, how he takes care of you. You're happy there, aren't you? Happier than you ever were with me and Ray?" Emma nodded, unable to speak. "Then I want you to stay there. Forever, if that's what you want. I'm going to sign papers giving Mr. Mitchell permission to adopt you, to be your legal father." The silence in the sheriff's office was profound. Janet Sterling made careful notes while Detective Santos waited patiently on the other end of the video call. "Are you sure, Mama?" Emma finally managed to ask. "I'm sure, baby. I love you enough to let you go to someone who can give you everything I couldn't. A safe home, a good education, a father who will never let anyone hurt you." Eleanor turned her attention to Jacob. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't know you very well, but I know you saved my daughter's life. Will you promise me something?" "Anything." Jacob said, "Promise me you'll tell her about me sometimes. Not the bad parts, but the good ones. Tell her that I love her, and that giving her to you was the hardest and most important thing I ever did." "I promise," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. The legal proceedings moved quickly after that. Elena Rodriguez signed the custody relinquishment papers from her hospital bed, with Detective Santos and a court-appointed advocate serving as witnesses. Janet Sterling expedited the adoption paperwork, citing the unusual circumstances and Emma's clear preference for placement. 6 weeks later, Jacob stood in a Montana courtroom wearing his best suit and holding Emma's hand as Judge Rebecca Walsh made their family official. "By the power vested in me by the state of Montana," the judge said solemnly, "I hereby grant the petition for adoption. Emma Rodriguez is now Emma Mitchell, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails." The gavel came down with a satisfying thud, and suddenly Emma was launching herself into Jacob's arms, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Emma skipping beside him with her adoption certificate clutched in her hand, Jacob thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a scared, starving child hiding in his stable to a confident, loved daughter walking proudly at his side. "Dad," Emma said, testing the word that was now officially accurate. "Yes, sweetheart. Can we go home now? I want to tell Buck he has a sister." Jacob laughed, thinking about his ornery old gelding and how he'd react to Emma's latest announcement. "Let's go home, Emma. Let's go home." As they drove back to the ranch, the Montana mountains standing as eternal witness to their happiness, Jacob realized that his life had finally come full circle. He'd started as a lonely widower in an empty house, and somehow, against all odds, he'd become a father to the most extraordinary child he'd ever known. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and promise. There would be challenges ahead, teenage years, college applications, first heartbreaks, and all the joys and sorrows that came with raising a child. But they would face them together as a real family, with love and trust and the unshakable bond forged in crisis and strengthened by choice. Emma Mitchell was finally home. 3 years later, The Mitchell ranch bore little resemblance to the quiet, lonely place Jacob had inhabited before Emma's arrival. The pastures were alive with activity. 2 new quarter horses grazed alongside Buck, who had appointed himself their unofficial leader despite being well into his 20s. A small flock of chickens pecked around the yard, tended daily by Emma, who had developed an unexpected talent for poultry management. The house itself had undergone a transformation that went beyond mere decoration. Where once Jacob had lived, surrounded by memories of Sarah, now the rooms buzzed with the energy of an active teenager. Emma's artwork covered the refrigerator, her books spilled from shelves in the living room, and her riding boots stood eternally muddy by the back door despite countless reminders about cleaning them. At 13, Emma Mitchell had grown into a confident young woman who bore little resemblance to the terrified child Jacob had found in his stable. She was tall for her age, with her mother's delicate features but Jacob's determined chin. Her hair had grown long and wild, constantly escaping from the braids she wore while working around the ranch. Most remarkably, her eyes had lost that haunted wariness, replaced by the bright curiosity of someone who no longer feared what tomorrow might bring. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. The first year had brought nightmares that sent Emma running to Jacob's room at 2 in the morning. Panic attacks triggered by unexpected loud noises, and moments of regression when stress overwhelmed her carefully constructed sense of security. Dr. Sarah Chen had referred them to a trauma specialist in Billings, and Emma had spent months learning coping strategies and processing techniques that helped her heal from years of abuse. But gradually, inevitably, the scared little girl had given way to a remarkable young woman who excelled in school, showed genuine leadership among her peers, and possessed an intuitive understanding of animals that bordered on supernatural. This particular morning found Emma in the main pasture, working with a 3-year-old mare named Starlight, who had arrived at the ranch 6 months earlier as a rescue from a failed breeding operation. The horse had been starved and mistreated, arriving with trust issues that mirrored Emma's own initial wariness. Jacob leaned against the fence rail, watching his daughter work with the mare with infinite patience. Emma held a halter in one hand and spoke in the soft, steady voice she used with all frightened creatures. Starlight stood 20 feet away, ears forward but muscles tense, caught between desire for human connection and deeply ingrained fear. "Easy, girl," Emma murmured, taking a single step forward. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore. You're safe here." The words hit Jacob with unexpected force. How many times had he said similar things to Emma in those early days? How many times had she needed to hear that safety was possible, that not all adults brought pain? Starlight took a tentative step toward Emma, then another. Emma remained perfectly still, letting the horse choose the pace of their interaction. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Starlight approached close enough for Emma to gently stroke her neck. "That's it," Emma whispered, slowly slipping the halter over the mare's head. "See? Not so scary after all." Jacob felt pride swell in his chest as he watched Emma lead Starlight toward the barn. His daughter had discovered her calling in working with damaged animals, bringing the same patience and understanding to their healing that others had shown her. The ranch had evolved from a simple cattle operation into something approaching a rescue facility, with Emma as the primary horse whisperer. "Looking good out there," Jacob called as Emma approached the fence. Emma's face lit up with the smile that never failed to warm his heart. "She's ready for saddle training, I think. Another few weeks, and she'll be ready for someone to love her properly." It was a pattern they'd established over the years. Emma would work with the rescue horses until they were healthy and trainable. Then Jacob would find them homes with families who would appreciate their gentle natures and hard-won trust. It was deeply satisfying work that served both the animals and Emma's healing process. Speaking of which, Jacob said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "We got a letter from the Hendersons about Moonbeam." Emma snatched the envelope. Eagerly, 6 months earlier, they'd placed a rescued gelding with a family in Wyoming whose teenage daughter had been struggling with anxiety and depression. The horse and girl had bonded immediately, beginning a healing process that benefited them both. Emma read the letter aloud, her voice growing more excited with each paragraph. Moonbeam had not only adapted beautifully to his new home, but he'd also helped his young rider regain confidence and joy in life. The girl's parents credited the horse with transforming their family dynamics. "This is why we do it," Emma said, carefully folding the letter. "This is what makes all the hard work worth it." Jacob nodded, understanding that Emma wasn't just talking about the horses. She was talking about the power of healing love, about second chances and new beginnings, about the miraculous transformations that were possible when damaged souls found. Safe harbor. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention to the long gravel driveway. A familiar white pickup truck was making its way toward the house, raising a cloud of dust in its wake. "Sheriff Patterson," Emma observed. "Wonder what brings him out here." Jacob wondered the same thing. Dave Patterson's visits these days were usually social calls, checking in on their progress and sharing local gossip over coffee. But something about his purposeful approach suggested this wasn't a casual drop-by. They met Dave at the house, where he climbed out of his truck with the deliberate movements of a man whose arthritis was getting worse with each passing year. At 68, he'd been talking about retirement for the past 3 years, though he showed no signs of actually following through on the threat. "Jacob, Emma," Dave greeted them with his characteristic warmth. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Just the usual horse therapy session," Emma replied. "Starlight's making real progress." "That's wonderful to hear. Emma, you've got a real gift with those animals." Emma beamed at the compliment, but Jacob noticed that Dave's expression remained serious despite his friendly words. Whatever had brought him out here wasn't entirely good news. "Coffee?" Jacob offered as they walked toward the house. "That'd be great, thanks." They settled around the kitchen table that had become the unofficial meeting place for all significant conversations in the Mitchell household. Emma automatically busied herself with preparing coffee and setting out homemade cookies, hospitality habits that Sarah would have appreciated. "So, what brings you by, Dave?" Jacob asked, once they were all seated. Sheriff Patterson glanced at Emma, then back at Jacob. "I got a call yesterday from the Nevada Department of Corrections. Ray Valdez is being released next month." The words hit the kitchen like a physical force. Emma's hand froze halfway to her coffee mug, and Jacob felt his stomach drop to somewhere around his boots. "Released." Jacob's voice was carefully controlled, but Emma could probably hear the anger underneath. "He was sentenced to 15 years for attempted murder." "Good behavior, overcrowding, some legal technicality," his lawyer found. "He'll serve less than 4 years total." Dave's expression showed exactly what he thought of the justice system's failures. "He'll be on parole, with strict conditions about staying away from Elena Rodriguez and maintaining distance from Nevada." "What about Emma?" Jacob asked, his protective instincts flaring to life. "Are there restrictions about contacting her?" "That's the problem. Emma wasn't technically a victim in the case that sent him to prison. The charges were all related to his assault on Elena Rodriguez. There's no legal restriction preventing him from trying to contact Emma." Emma found her voice, though it was shakier than usual. "Does he know where I am?" "We don't think so," Dave said gently. "Your adoption records are sealed, and your name change makes you harder to track. But Emma, honey, we need to be realistic about the possibilities. Ray Valdez is a violent man with a history of obsessive behavior. There's a chance he might try to find you." Jacob's mind was already racing through security measures, contingency plans, worst-case scenarios. What are our options? Prevention and preparation, Dave replied. I've already contacted federal authorities about the interstate implications. If Valdez were to come looking for Emma, I've also reached out to Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks about increasing security patrols in this area. You think he'd actually come here? Emma asked, her voice small. Probably not, Dave said honestly. Most parolees are focused on staying out of trouble and rebuilding their lives. But Ray Valdez isn't a parolee. His psychological profile suggests someone who blames others for his problems and holds grudges for years. Jacob reached across the table and took Emma's hand. Whatever happens, we'll deal with it together, just like we always have. Emma squeezed his hand but didn't look entirely convinced. The confidence she'd built over 3 years was being tested by the specter of her past returning to threaten her carefully constructed new life. There's something else, Dave continued. I spoke with Elena Rodriguez yesterday. She wanted me to pass along a message. Emma straightened in her chair. Contact with her birth mother had been sporadic over the years. Holiday cards, occasional phone calls, updates on her recovery progress. Elena had rebuilt her life in a new city, working as a pharmacy technician and attending community college to finish her education. She'd respected the boundaries of Emma's new life while maintaining a connection that meant the world to both of them. What did she say? Emma asked. She wanted you to know that if Ray does try to contact you, you shouldn't feel guilty about any of it. She said to remind you that his actions are his responsibility, not yours, and that you deserve to be safe and happy regardless of what he does. Tears welled in Emma's eyes. Even after all these years, even after the trauma and separation and legal proceedings, Elena Rodriguez still knew exactly what her daughter needed to hear. She also said, Dave continued with a slight smile, that she's proud of the young woman you've become, and that giving you to Jacob was the smartest thing she ever did. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Can you tell her I said thank you and that I love her too? Of course I can. They spent the next hour discussing practical security measures. Jacob would install better lighting around the property and upgrade the locks on all doors and windows. Emma would carry a cell phone at all times and check in regularly when she was away from the ranch. They'd establish code words and emergency procedures, and Jacob would apply for a concealed carry permit. Most importantly, they'd continue living their lives without allowing fear to dominate their choices. Ray Valdez had already stolen enough from Emma's childhood. They wouldn't let him steal her teenage years as well. That evening, as Jacob tucked Emma into bed, a ritual they'd maintained despite her protests that she was too old for it, she surprised him with a question that showed how much she'd grown. Dad, are you scared? Jacob considered lying, offering reassurance that would be more comforting than honest. But their relationship had been built on truth, even when truth was difficult. Yes, he admitted. I'm scared of anything that might hurt you or disrupt the life we've built together. But Emma, I'm not scared of Ray Valdez specifically. I'm a different man than I was 3 years ago, and you're a different person too. We're stronger now, smarter, more prepared. Emma nodded thoughtfully. I used to have nightmares about him finding me, but lately when I think about him, I mostly just feel sad for him. He's wasted his whole life being angry and violent, and now he's going to waste whatever time he has left the same way. Jacob marveled at his daughter's insight and maturity. The scared little girl who had hidden in his stable had grown into a young woman capable of wisdom and even compassion for those who had hurt her. That's very mature of you, sweetheart. I learned it from watching you, Emma said simply. You never taught me to hate him or Mom or anyone else. You just taught me that some people are damaged and make bad choices, but that doesn't mean I have to let their damage become mine. Jacob kissed her forehead, overwhelmed with love for this remarkable child who had somehow become the center of his universe. Sweet dreams, Emma. Tomorrow's going to be a good day. How do you know? Jacob smiled, thinking about the mare that was learning to trust again, the rescue horses that would find loving homes, the full life they'd built together on this Montana ranch. "Because every day with you is a good day," he said simply. As Jacob walked downstairs to check the locks and turn off the lights, he thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A scared child hiding in his stable had grown into a confident young woman who could face down her demons with courage and grace. A lonely widower had discovered that love multiplied rather than divided, that opening his heart to Emma had somehow made him more himself rather than less. Ray Valdez might be getting out of prison, but he was stepping into a world where Emma Mitchell was no longer his victim. She was Jacob Mitchell's daughter, a member of the Cedar Falls community, a young woman with friends and teachers and neighbors who cared about her safety. She was protected not just by locks and security systems, but by the unbreakable bonds of chosen family and community love. Outside, the Montana mountains stood eternal watch over the ranch, witnesses to another chapter in the ongoing story of healing and hope that had begun with a starving girl in a stable and a rancher who chose kindness over convenience. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, stronger, wiser, and unafraid. 6 months after Ray Valdez's release, the Mitchell Ranch had settled into a new kind of vigilant normalcy. Security cameras now monitored the perimeter, motion sensor lights illuminated the driveways, and Jacob carried his cell phone everywhere, habits that had become second nature without feeling oppressive. Emma was in the barn grooming Starlight. When the stranger appeared, she noticed him first as a shadow at the edge of her peripheral vision, a figure standing too still among the moving horses in the pasture. Her hands stilled on the curry comb, as every survival instinct she'd thought she'd outgrown suddenly roared back to life. The man was tall and lean, wearing faded jeans and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He stood about 50 yards away, watching the barn with the focused intensity of someone conducting surveillance rather than casual observation. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to think clearly. The barn had multiple exits, her cell phone was in her back pocket, and Jacob was working in the nearby equipment shed. She wasn't the helpless child she'd once been. Moving slowly to avoid startling Starlight or alerting the stranger to her awareness, Emma pulled out her phone and sent a text to Jacob. "Strange man watching barn. Is past your fence." The response came immediately. "Stay calm. On my way." Emma continued grooming Starlight while keeping the stranger in her peripheral vision. He hadn't moved closer, which was either reassuring or meant he was waiting for something or someone. 2 minutes later, Jacob appeared at the barn entrance, moving with the casual confidence of someone checking on routine ranch work. But Emma noticed the way his hand rested near the radio on his belt and how his eyes swept the pasture systematically. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, his voice carrying the normal volume of everyday conversation. "Starlight's doing great," Emma replied, matching his tone. "That man by the fence has been watching for about 5 minutes. Jacob glanced toward the pasture, and Emma saw his shoulders tense slightly. The stranger was still there, but now he was walking along the fence line, examining it with the interest of someone assessing property boundaries or security weaknesses. "Emma, I want you to take Starlight into the back stall and stay there until I come get you. Dad, no arguments, please." The urgency in Jacob's voice convinced her more than his words. Emma led Starlight to the rear of the barn, positioning herself where she could see the main entrance while remaining hidden from outside view. Jacob walked out of the barn and approached the stranger with the steady pace of a man comfortable on his own property. Emma watched through a gap in the stall boards as the two men converged near the fence. Even at a distance, she could see the stranger was younger than she'd initially thought. Maybe mid-30s, with the wiry build of someone who stayed in, shaped through physical labor rather than gym workouts. When he turned to face Jacob, Emma caught a glimpse of his profile and felt her blood freeze. The bone structure was wrong, the hair color different, but something about the way he held his head, the aggressive set of his shoulders, triggered memories she'd worked years to suppress. This wasn't Ray Valdez. She was certain of that. But the resemblance was strong enough to send her pulse racing. The conversation between Jacob and the stranger was too distant for Emma to hear individual words, but she could read the body language clearly enough. Jacob stood with his arms crossed, projecting calm authority. The stranger gestured toward the barn, the house, the horses, asking questions that Jacob answered with minimal responses. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, the stranger walked back toward a dirt bike parked beyond the fence line. Jacob remained motionless until the engine started and the bike disappeared down the mountain road. Only then did Jacob return to the barn, his expression grim but controlled. "Who was he?" Emma asked immediately. "Said his name was Tommy Valdez, Ray's younger brother." Emma felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. "He found me!" "Not necessarily. He was asking about buying horses, said he'd heard we had a rescue operation. Could be legitimate. But Jacob's tone suggested he didn't believe his own words anymore. Then Emma did. What did he want to know? General questions about the ranch, how long we'd been here, whether we had any kids who helped with the horses. Jacob's jaw tightened. I told him we were a small operation focused on rehabilitation work, not sales. Emma sank onto a hay bale, her legs suddenly unsteady. He's going to tell Ray where I am. We don't know that, sweetheart. And even if it does, we're prepared. Jacob pulled out his phone and dialed Sheriff Patterson's number. Emma listened as he reported the encounter, describing Tommy Valdez's appearance and behavior in detail. Dave promised to run the name through his database and contact the parole officer monitoring Ray's activities. But Emma barely heard the conversation. Her mind was spinning with implications and possibilities, each worse than the last. If Ray knew where she was, would he come himself or send others? Would he try to hurt Jacob to get to her? Would he attempt something at school, where security was minimal and Emma was most vulnerable? Emma. Jacob's voice cut through her spiral of anxiety. Look at me. She met his eyes, seeing the same determination that had sustained them through 3 years of challenges. We've built something strong here, he said quietly. You, me, this ranch, our place in this community. Ray Valdez and his family don't get to take that away from us. Not now, not ever. But what if he comes here? Then we deal with it. What if he tries to hurt you? Then he deals with me and the sheriff and everyone else in Cedar Falls who cares about you. What if he's smarter than we expect? Then we get smarter too. Jacob sat beside her on the hay bale, his presence solid and reassuring. Emma, you spent the first 10 years of your life being afraid of Ray Valdez. Are you going to spend the rest of your life afraid of him too? The question hit her like a physical blow. Was that what she was doing? Letting a man who had already stolen her childhood now steal her adolescence and adulthood as well? No, she said quietly, then stronger. No, I'm not. Good. Because I have a proposition for you. Emma looked at him suspiciously. Jacob's propositions usually involved challenges that pushed her far outside her comfort zone. The state 4-H championship is next month. You've been training Starlight for months, and she's ready to compete. I think you should enter. Dad, that's in Billings. It's 3 days away from the ranch. Hundreds of people, tons of publicity. Exactly. It's time to stop hiding and start living. If Ray Valdez wants to find you, he'll find you whether you're competing in horse shows or hiding in the barn. But only one of those options lets you become the person you're meant to be. Emma stared at him, recognizing the wisdom in his words but terrified by their implications. Competing at the state level would mean media coverage, photographs in newspapers, her name in public records. It would also mean pursuing her dreams instead of limiting them out of fear. What if something happens while we're there? Then Sheriff Patterson will handle it here, and we'll handle whatever we need to handle there. Together. Emma thought about Starlight, about the months they'd spent building trust and partnership. The mayor had overcome her trauma to become a confident, capable competitor. Maybe it was time for Emma to do the same. You really think she's ready? I think you're both ready. That evening, Emma called her birth mother for the first time in 6 months. Elena Rodriguez had moved to Phoenix after her recovery, working as a pharmacy supervisor and taking evening classes toward a nursing degree. The monthly update cards she sent were filled with pride in Emma's accomplishments and gratitude for Jacob's continued guardianship. Mija, Elena's voice was warm with surprise and pleasure. How wonderful to hear from you. Hi, Mama. I needed to talk to someone, and Dad thought you might have some good advice. Emma explained about Tommy Valdez's visit and Jacob's suggestion about the state championship. Elena listened without interruption, occasionally making soft sounds of understanding or concern. What are you afraid of, baby? Elena asked when Emma finished. That Ray will hurt Dad because of me, that I'll lose everything I've built here, that I'm not strong enough to handle whatever comes next. Elena was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the hard-won wisdom of someone who had survived her own form of hell. Emma, when I gave you to Jacob, I thought I was protecting you from Ray's violence, but I was also protecting you from my weakness. I didn't want you to grow up watching me fail to be brave. Mama, let me finish. You have something I never had, a father who believes in your strength instead of your fragility. Use that gift, Mija. Be the brave woman I always hoped you could become. After hanging up, Emma found Jacob on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. She settled into the chair beside him, drawing comfort from his steady presence. I want to compete, she said simply. Jacob smiled. I was hoping you'd say that, but I want to do it right. Full security, backup plans, communication protocols. If we're going to stop hiding, we're going to be smart about it. Agreed. We'll coordinate with law enforcement, arrange for private security if necessary, and make sure everyone knows exactly what to do if there's a problem. Emma nodded, feeling a familiar flutter of nervous excitement. It was the same feeling she'd had the first time she'd climbed onto Buck's back, the first day of school in Cedar Falls, the first time she'd told someone her real story, the feeling that came with choosing courage over comfort. Dad, thank you for not letting me stay scared forever. Thank you for being brave enough to let me help. As the stars emerged over the Montana sky, Emma Mitchell, former runaway, current horse whisperer, future state champion, sat beside her adoptive father and planned for a competition that would announce to the world that she was no longer hiding. Ray Valdez had taught her to fear. Jacob Mitchell had taught her to hope. Now it was time to teach herself to soar. The morning of the state 4-H championship dawned clear and cold in Billings, Montana. Emma stood outside Starlight's temporary stall at the Metropark complex, watching. Her horse eat breakfast with the calm confidence of an animal who trusted her human completely. The mare's transformation mirrored Emma's own, from terrified and broken to strong and ready for anything. Jacob approached with 2 steaming cups of coffee, handing one to Emma, despite her protests that she was too nervous to drink anything. Nervous. Energy needs fuel, he said, settling against the stall door beside her. Besides, Starlight needs you to be calm and focused. Around them, the massive facility buzzed with activity. Competitors from across Montana were preparing for various events. Livestock judging, agricultural demonstrations, horse competitions spanning every discipline from barrel racing to dressage. Emma had qualified in the rescue horse rehabilitation category, a newer division that showcased the partnership between young people and formerly abused or neglected animals. Any word from Sheriff Patterson? Emma asked, though she tried to keep her voice casual. Jacob checked his phone. All quiet on the home front. Dave's got extra patrols running past the ranch, and Tommy Valdez hasn't been seen in Cedar Falls since his visit last week. The security arrangements for the competition were comprehensive, but subtle. 2 plainclothes officers mingled with the crowd. Jacob carried a discreet radio that connected him directly to local law enforcement, and Emma wore a GPS tracker disguised as a regular fitness watch. They'd registered under slightly altered names to avoid easy identification, though Emma's real identity would be revealed if she placed in the top 3. Mitchell Ranch, Emma. A voice behind them made both Emma and Jacob turn. A young woman about Emma's age approached with a friendly smile. She wore the uniform of a competitor, with patches indicating she was from a ranch near Great Falls. Her blonde hair was braided neatly, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd grown up around horses. "I'm Jessica Morrison, from the Lazy K Ranch. I've heard amazing things about your work with rescue horses. Would you mind if I watched your presentation later?" Emma felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that came with unexpected attention, but she pushed it aside. This was exactly the kind of interaction she'd been avoiding for years, the normal socialization of teenagers who shared common interests. "Sure," Emma said, managing a genuine smile. "I'd like that. This is my dad, Jacob Mitchell. Nice to meet you both. My dad's around here somewhere. He's been doing 4-H for about 20 years as a volunteer coordinator. Says the rescue category is one of his favorites because it shows real-world problem-solving." As Jessica walked away, Emma realized something significant had just happened. She'd introduced Jacob as her dad without hesitation, claimed the Mitchell name with pride, and engaged in normal teenage conversation without once thinking about her complicated past. "You handled that beautifully," Jacob observed. "It felt natural," Emma said, surprised by her own reaction. "I wasn't pretending to be someone else or hiding anything. I was just me." 2 hours later, Emma entered the main arena for her presentation. The space was enormous, with bleachers filled with families and competitors. Judges sat at a long table near the center, their clipboards ready to score presentations on technical skill, horse improvement, and the quality of the human-animal bond. Emma led Starlight into the arena, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon them. 6 months ago, this level of exposure would have sent her into a panic attack. Today, she felt nervous but excited, the good kind of nerves that sharpened focus rather than scattered it. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice echoed through the arena, presenting Emma Mitchell from Cedar Falls with her rescue horse Starlight. Emma began her presentation, explaining Starlight's background as a starved and abused breeding horse who had been rescued 18 months earlier. She demonstrated the mare's initial fearfulness, then showed the gradual building of trust through consistent, patient work. "Healing takes time," Emma said, her voice carrying clearly through. "The arena's sound system. Whether you're a horse or a human, learning to trust again after trauma requires someone willing to prove that safety is possible." As she spoke, Emma realized she wasn't just talking about Starlight. She was telling her own story through the lens of animal rehabilitation, sharing the lessons she'd learned about resilience and recovery without exposing the private details of her past. The demonstration portion showcased Starlight's newfound confidence. The mare performed complex ground exercises loaded calmly into a trailer, and even allowed strangers to approach and pet her, behaviors that would have been impossible during her early rescue days. "The goal isn't to erase the past," Emma concluded, her hand resting on Starlight's neck. "It's to prove that the past doesn't have to define the future. Starlight will always be a rescue horse, but she's also a champion who can teach other horses and humans that healing is possible." The applause was thunderous. Emma felt tears prick her eyes as she looked up at the bleachers and saw Jacob on his feet clapping with unmistakable pride. Around him, other families and competitors were standing as well, recognizing something special in what they'd just witnessed. The judging seemed to take forever. Emma waited in the warm-up area with Starlight, accepting congratulations from other competitors and their families. Jessica Morrison found her there, breathless with excitement. "That was incredible," Jessica said. "You weren't just showing horse training, you were showing everyone how to hope." Emma felt a warm glow of satisfaction. She'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do, demonstrate that broken things could be made whole, that trauma could be overcome, that love and patience could triumph over fear and pain. When the results were announced, Emma's name was called for first place in the rescue rehabilitation category. As she led Starlight back into the arena to receive her ribbon, the crowd rose to its feet again. The announcer mentioned that Emma would advance to the national competition in Oklahoma, representing Montana in the rescue division. Standing in the center of the arena with the blue ribbon in her hand, Emma looked up at the bleachers and found Jacob's face in the crowd. He was crying, something she'd never seen him do, and mouthing the words, "I'm proud of you." But more than his pride, Emma felt her own sense of accomplishment. She'd stood in front of hundreds of strangers and told a version of her story. She'd claimed her place in the world without apology or explanation. She'd chosen visibility over hiding, competition over safety, growth over stagnation. After the awards ceremony, as they loaded Starlight into the trailer for the journey home, Emma's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Her stomach dropped, remembering all the security briefings about potential contact from Ray or his associates. But when she opened the message, it was from Elena Rodriguez. "Saw the live stream of your competition online. You were magnificent. Mija, your courage makes me brave too. Te amo." Emma showed the text to Jacob, who smiled as he read it. "Your mother's right. You were magnificent today." As they drove through the Montana darkness toward Cedar Falls, Emma reflected on the day's events. She'd won a competition, yes, but more importantly, she'd won something back from her past. She'd reclaimed her right to be seen, to be celebrated, to take up space in the world without fear. "Dad?" she said, as familiar landmarks began appearing. "In the headlights. Yes, sweetheart? Thank you for making me do this, for not letting me stay small." Jacob glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "You were never small, Emma. You just needed time to remember how big you actually are." The ranch appeared ahead of them, its security lights casting welcoming pools of brightness across the yard. As they pulled into the driveway, Emma could see Buck hanging his head over the pasture fence, as if he'd been waiting for their return. Home. That's what this place was now. Not just a refuge from her past, but a launching pad for her future. The scared, starving girl who had hidden in Jacob's stable 4 years ago was gone, replaced by a confident young woman who could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Ray Valdez might still be out there somewhere, but Emma Mitchell, champion, daughter, survivor, was no longer afraid of him. She'd found something stronger than fear. She'd found herself. As they unloaded Starlight and settled her back into her familiar stall, Emma looked around at the ranch that had become her world. The mountains stood eternal in the moonlight. The horses dozed peacefully in their pastures, and somewhere in the house, the kitchen light was on, a beacon of warmth and safety that would always welcome her home. The girl in the stable had become the woman in the arena. And tomorrow she would wake up ready for whatever came next, surrounded by love, supported by community, and unafraid of the future she was brave enough to claim. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.